Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on rational appeasement. Previously, we have seen how fighting might be necessary to protect one's reputation. You're a government, you have a first rebel group come and demand concessions out of you. You might not give those concessions, you might be willing to induce a fight because you're worried that if you give up concessions, you'll look weak and more rebel groups will sprout up and ask for concessions out of you. So you fight up front not because it's cost efficient to do so, but rather because you want to deter potential future rivals from asking for stuff out of you. Now, that's great. It's a good theory about how reputation is something that you need to acquire, but there's often a big component missing from these reputation arguments. And that big component is that fighting isn't easy, and it's certainly not free. Fighting is costly. If you go to war against one group, you're going to have some of your military resources destroyed. And if some of your military resources are destroyed, you're not going to have those military resources to coerce another group. So think about this situation. Imagine that there are two potential rebel groups in your country. Call them R1 and R2. And imagine that you don't really care much about R1 and what R1 wants out of you. You don't really value that very much. But you do care a lot about what R2 might be demanding out of you. So imagine a situation where R1 comes up to you and asks for concessions. What are you going to do? Well, you have two choices here. First choice is to give in. This signals an unwillingness to fight. Not a particularly good thing for the reasons that we've discussed before. Your second choice is to fight. This might protect your reputation, but it's going to come at the cost of wasting resources. Some of your military dudes, some of your tanks, some of all those weapons that you have are going to be destroyed in battle. And so those resources that you had before, you will not have when you go and bargain against R2. Neither one of these is a particularly good choice, but you can imagine that if fighting is going to destroy a whole bunch of resources, you're not going to choose choice 2. You're going to give in. And moreover, note that if you are R2 and you are watching this situation and you know that if the government fights R1, that a lot of its military resources are going to be destroyed, well, you're not really learning too much about the government being weak as a result of that, because you know that the government is not fighting the rebel group, the first rebel group, because it's weak to some degree, but rather it's not fighting the first rebel group precisely because it wants to be in a position to kick your butt. So as a result, because fighting destroys resources, you might rationally appease that first rebel group so you're stronger when you negotiate with that second rebel group. Now, I want to briefly apply this to the Syrian civil war and the United States possibly intervening in that civil war. So about 6 months ago, Syria was found out that the government was using chemical weapons, and so there was a push in the United States to intervene in the Syrian civil war to stop Syria from using chemical weapons. Now, one of the arguments for why the United States should have intervened in this civil war was because Iran was watching. And so if Iran is watching us and we act weak in the Syrian civil war, that might prompt Iran to interpret that as us being weak, the United States being weak, and Iran might be more aggressive in its nuclear negotiations as a result. On the other hand, you can make the same argument that Iran is watching as an argument not for why the United States should have intervened, but why the United States should not have intervened. If the United States had intervened in Syria, it might have weakened itself militarily. It might have wasted military resources to do that, and that would make it harder for the United States to stage a preventive strike against Iran and its nuclear program. So this reputation argument, the idea that you have other guys that you might be bargaining against in the future, and that might affect your negotiations up front, that actually cuts both ways. You have the incentives to protect your reputation, but you also have the incentives to maintain your military power by not getting yourself involved in the first fight. So that's rational appeasement for you. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope to see you next time. Take care.